So the book of 1 and 2 Kings. Last time, you remember we looked at Samuel, 1 and 2 Samuel, and that ends with the closing of David's life as he just is on his deathbed. And he hands over the kingdom after all the antics that go on with him leaving and coming back again. But he finally hands the kingdom over to his son Solomon. And that's where we left it at the end of Samuel. And then we have to remember that we have these kind of three active or two to three active covenants, if you like. So we have the Abrahamic covenant from Genesis 12 that's still in operation. That's the seven I wills that God says to the people of Israel, or to Abraham in particular, but I'm going to make your name great and they're going to be as numerous as the stars in the sky and so on. But then you also have the Mosaic covenant, which is given to Moses in the wilderness, that if you obey me as a people, then you will be my kingdom of priests and a holy nation and so on, and I'll give you the land. And we also then have the Davidic covenant that we looked at last time, which is kind of an extension of the Abrahamic covenant in 2 Samuel 7. And that is similar to the Abrahamic. It's seven I will statements that God makes. But there are three of them that are present that I'm going to make your name great, David, and I'm going to provide a place for my people and give you rest from all your enemies. But then there are these four future ones that I will raise up offspring to succeed you, establish his kingdom, establish his throne forever, and be his father, and he will be my son. And the reason I'm saying that is because in many ways that the book of 1 and 2 Kings is, which was originally one book, it was split later for ease in the Bible, but it was one original book together. But the reason I say that is because really they're looking in the book of Kings for the future messianic king from the Davidic covenant, that I will establish your throne forever and I will, bless you and so on. And you are going to be that blessing. I'll give you the land. And so they're looking for this future king that will kind of, and this kingly reign. And so every king that kind of comes on the scene, if you like, they're kind of asking that question, is this the future king or is this not the future king? And so they have the standards that they set throughout the book of 1 and 2 Kings that we'll see. And they kind of are asking that same question of everyone. Is this the continuation of the Davidic line? Is this the person that is going to essentially be the fulfillment of that Davidic covenant and that lineage will continue? And so that's what the book of 1 and Kings is really all about. It's split into five different sections, and you can see that section 1 and section 5 are both about Jerusalem. So in the start of 1 Kings, you have Jerusalem and the temple, and Solomon building his temple, and it goes into great detail about how he built the temple and so on, and that that was established, and then he built his own palace after that. And then at the end of the book, you have of Second Kings, you have Jerusalem's destruction and the temple's destruction and Israel's exile. So the kind of the temple forms the kind of the bookends, if you like, to what goes on in between. Then you have this disastrous split between Rehoboam and Jeroboam into the two kingdoms in the north and the south. You then get all the prophetic warnings, particularly through Elijah and Elisha, about that we'll look at in a little while. And then you get this in Second Kings, this downward spiral towards the exile of the north first in 722, and then the south in 586, and how they have broken the covenant and God removes them from the land and from his presence effectively. But let's start back at the beginning a little bit. Just one other thought. We're not going to look at 1 Chronicles next, but it's very, very similar. But there is a significant difference because the book of 1 and 2 Kings generally focuses on the northern kingdom. So most of the stories, Elijah and Elisha, for example, they're northern kingdom. And so you get far more focus on the northern kingdom than the southern. Whereas 1 and 2 Chronicles tends to focus on the southern kingdom rather than the north. And so you see the difference on Judah rather than Israel. And so you can see the difference. So there's a lot of overlap between the two, and we'll come and do that after Easter, 1 and 2 Chronicles. But also there is a significant difference in who they're focusing on. and so that's why they're there. Let's go back to 1 and 2 Kings. It starts really well, doesn't it? David instructs Solomon to keep the covenants, and Solomon then starts to build the temple. But David, even at the end of his life, kind of goes a bit off the rails. He then asks his new king, Solomon, to murder all David's enemies. He said, I made a covenant commitment with God that I wouldn't touch these people, some of Saul's family that was left, and some of the people that did him wrong. And he said, well, maybe they're acting on God's behalf. So he promised he wouldn't do anything. But then he said, well, Solomon, you didn't make that promise. So, as you're my good son, you can do it in my stead. So it starts off with Solomon sort of wiping out kind of family lines. So it doesn't really start well. And you see the seeds there, I think, of the demise that's going to come later on. As I said in chapters 5 to 8, it describes in great detail the building of the temple. And this is a picture here of what maybe the temple would have looked like. Solomon's temple, it was a massive, grand affair. It was built obviously to God's direction. David collected all the materials. Solomon then gets to build the temple. And it was amazing. And inside the temple, this is a picture of what they think it must have looked like. Gold from top to bottom. And as you see on the walls there, it very much tries to imitate with the animals and the palm branches and the figs and so on. It imitates the Eden, and it really, when you walked in there with all the shining gold that would have been around, it kind of takes you back to that presence in the Garden of Eden, and also, I guess, from some people, the tabernacle as well. And that was the whole idea, because Eden was the first place where heaven and earth met and where God's presence was dwelling with his people. As it says in the book of Genesis, right at the very start, that God was walking with Adam and Eve. God's presence was there. And there was a connection between heaven and earth. And the tabernacle, when that was built, and then the temple, when that was built, was the place that they believe where basically heaven and earth met, where God came down either in the cloud or in his Shekinah glory, and the distance between heaven and earth was very, very small. God was amongst his people, and he was there right in their presence. And so all the images you see in the temple, like the tabernacle before, that they carried in the wilderness, was reminding them of Eden, of the fruit of the garden, of God's presence amongst them, and that God was in their midst, and they were coming into God's presence to worship and adore him. And so it kind of took them all the way back to Adam and Eve in the garden. And that was the whole idea. Going back into the time of the kings, we need to kind of remember in Deuteronomy 17, verse 14 to 20, going all the way back, it spoke this about the kings that were to come. And these were the criteria that was set out and laid out in the law about how the kings were to behave. It says this: when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us, like all the nations around us, be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your fellow Israelites. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not an Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them, for the Lord has told you, you're not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law, taken from that of the Levitical priests. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God, and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and not to consider himself better than his fellow Israelites, and turn from the law to the right or to the left. Then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel. We see that, if you were to look at that list, that Solomon ends up breaking every single stipulation of Deuteronomy 17. He starts off so well while he's building the temple and then building his own palace, but then he starts to take on many, many wives. As it says, do not do that. Wives from outside of the people of Israel. He marries lots and lots of different nationalities and so on. He imports all their gods and he starts to worship. Then he grows his own wealth, so that wealth was like extreme. He took horses and chariots and everything else, and every single stipulation in Deuteronomy 17, Solomon breaks. And by the time he dies, he kind of resembles more Pharaoh than he does David. And he kind of does evil just like Pharaoh does or did, more than the covenant keeper of David. And in Solomon, you see this steady demise of going downhill throughout his life, and there's a really sad end to Solomon's reign. And so it kind of sets the scene, if you like, of what's going to happen next. You then, as we read the story, the kingdom then splits with his sons. Rehoboam becomes king, and he sets inordinate taxes over the people, and the northern kingdoms decide, no, we're not going to stick with that. And so his brother Jeroboam, they split off. And so you get 10 tribes in the northern kingdom of Israel, they call Israel then, and 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin stay in the south. And then what happens is in the northern kingdom, in Dan and Bethel, right at the very top, Dan, and at the bottom of Israel in Bethel, they set up a new temple because they're not going to come into the southern kingdom, their enemy, if you like, or the people that they hate now, into Jerusalem to come and worship. So the king sets up new temples there. In the temples, he books golden calves that they made, and effectively they go back to Egypt and they establish Samaria as the new capital in the middle where near where Shechem is, and they turn away from God and do their own thing. And so, as I said here, they set up a golden calf at both at Dan and at Bethel, or at the north and at the south of Israel. And it reminds us of the golden calf. If you remember in Exodus 32, when Moses was up the mountain receiving the Ten Commandments, and he comes down and they're all worshipping the golden calf from Egypt that they'd made. And you remember Moses then breaks the covenant, and he's so mad, and they have to repent, otherwise God's going to wipe them out there and then. And so when they split, you see, because they don't have Jerusalem, they set up their own religion, they set up their own faith, and they go back to what they knew all those years ago from the Egyptian kind of way of worship. And then as it unfolds through all these different kings that we have in the north and the south, it gets quite confusing as it goes backwards and forwards. But basically, every king is evaluated throughout the book of Kings. And they were evaluated on these 3 things. Firstly, do they worship God of Israel alone? Are they true to Yahweh, in other words, or do they worship other gods, or do whatever they want to do? What do they do about the land that they inherit? Do they rid it of idolatry or other gods, or do some of them allow other gods, and some of them even promote other faiths and other gods in their land? And so they're kind of judged based on that. And then also the faithfulness to the covenant. Are they faithful like David? Are they repentant when they see something that's gone wrong? Do they come back to the covenant, or do they just carry on going the way they want to go? And so these 3 things are kind of a criteria. So they judge it, and they will say, well, they're not like their father David. In other words, they didn't worship God alone. They didn't rid the land of the idolatry. They didn't encourage everybody all the time to worship Yahweh alone, and they're not faithful to the law of the covenant and the priesthood and so on, and the sacrifices and everything else. And so these are the 3 things that each king that comes, whether it's north or south, are really kind of held up against this filter, if you like, to see how they perform. this is a kind of a map, if you like, of all the kings. There's 20 kings in the north and 20 kings in the south, um, after Saul, David, and Solomon. Um, and you'll see in the north, they're all red at the top there, which meant that in Israel, there was not a single good king, or even a neutral king. Um, they're all bad kings. And so they just go after generation after generation after generation. There's no break in their breaking of those three things that we've just looked at. In the south, you get kind of a mix, a more of a mix. So out of the 20, there are four that they are considered good. They're like their father David. There are another four that are considered, well, they did some good things, but they didn't really break down the Asherah poles or the Baal and all those kind of things. They kind of allowed a lot of other things to happen, but they themselves weren't bad. And then the rest of them are evil, just like the north. And you can see right at the end, the last four in the southern kingdom are all bad after King Josiah's reign comes to an end. There's nothing good left in Judah, and it goes the way of Israel in the north. Also in here we see prophets, mainly Elisha and or Elijah and Elisha. But prophets were not really there to tell people about the future. They're there really to act like kind of covenant police, if you like. What they did all the time was they went and they saw whether the kings were meeting those criteria that we've just spoken about. And they would watch what was going on in the land, and they would then speak the word of God to the kings when the kings generally were disobeying the covenant laws. So you remember with Elijah and Ahab, he kind of says, "Oh, here comes Elijah again. He's never got anything good to tell me." But that's because, well, one, they were up in the north, and he was a bad king, but he was like this. The voice of God really just saying, you're continually doing wicked, you're continually doing wrong, and you need to change your way, repent, and get back into where you should be. And so the prophets were kind of like those covenant police. So they had the law, and they would then apply the law to what they saw around them, and come and give warnings of where this was headed. Obviously, it was not adhered to. There are two prominent prophets. There are many prophets that we read about in the books of the Kings, but obviously the big ones in the middle of the book, at the end of 1 Kings and the beginning of 2 Kings, the separation is between Elijah and Elisha, which are the two major prophets that you see. I just thought you'd be interested. I've just put up a picture that they found of Baal. This was like a little image that they found that's now in the Louvre in Paris, of a little statue of worshipping to Baal. And the Asherah poles were kind of trees or poles that they would make, and they would worship these symbols, human symbols, if you like, of the gods. And so when it says that they were worshiping Baals, they would have these statues that they would fall down and worship in front of, and or in their houses and so on. And then the Asherah poles would be out in the countryside. There would be trees, or there would be these poles that were erected that they would then go and worship at, and or in the high places up on hillsides or mountains at the top of there, they would put these symbols, if you like. A little bit like today, if you go to Rio, you've got the Christ, at the top there for everybody to see. I think in Israel, at the top of hills, and that they would have these poles there that people would go to worship the different gods and so on. Another interesting thing about the Elijah and Elisha is that actually all the miracles that they do, all the stories that we read about, they found not too long ago, number of years ago, but not, in the last, I don't know when it was they found it, but they found this cuneiform text called the Ras Shamra. And in that, it was describing the characteristics of the Canaanite gods. It was all done in cuneiform. And when they managed to translate it, it described on the left these characteristics of the Baal, the god of the Canaanites. And he was the god of fire and lightning, of rain and fertility, oil and grain, child-giving, healing, resurrection, one who mounts up on clouds, and the one who overpowers the sea and the rivers. And so it's interesting that the stories that we have of Elijah and Elisha are stories that directly kind of, if you like, go against the characteristics of Baal. So Baal was known for the god of fire and lightning. So you remember the story on Mount Carmel, where he says, "Okay, we're going to build these two altars, and you need to." We'll allow our gods to send down the fire and the lightning because it was the key characteristic of Baal. So when he got all the prophets of Baal to kind of go around and they were all, trying to get their God, it was because that was one of the key characteristics of God, of their God Baal, that he was the God of fire. And all of these stories that we see, the seven stories of Elijah and the 14 of Elisha, are all, if you like, to say, to really illustrate and to say that Yahweh is the true God. You think you're worshiping the God of fire, but he can't send fire, whereas Yahweh sends fire. You think you're the God of rain, but actually it's Yahweh that can stop the rain or bring the rain when he wants to do that. You're the God, you think Baal's the God of oil and grain, but with the Shunammite woman, it's when she ran out and she never ran out of oil and she never ran out of grain to make bread for Elijah. Our God is, or the God of Yahweh is the God, the real God that gives all these things. And so the stories are it's very interesting, very unique in a sense that it's going against the God of the Canaanites and the God that Israel were worshiping at that time, predominantly, saying that actually Yahweh is the real God that does all these things, not Baal. And so I showed you this last time, but so you see the two kingdoms there, and on the right you can see the kind of the different kings. You've got the kings of Israel, all bad, on the right-hand side, the kings of Judah on the left-hand side, some bad ones, some moderate, and some that are actually good. And then in 722, the northern kingdom was invaded by the Assyrians. And then they came down and they camped outside Jerusalem. And if you remember, under Hezekiah, and then God sent the angel to wipe out the Assyrian army, and then they went and left them. But in 586 or around 600, and then 586 again, the Babylonians came in and they took over the kingdom of Judah, so that everybody was removed from the land. As I said, just a summary, there were 20 kings in both Israel and Judah, 20 in each. There were no good kings in Israel, 4 moderate kings and 4 good kings, Asa, Jehoshaphat, Hezekiah, and Josiah in the south. And so you see the steady demise of what's going on. In 2 Kings chapter 17, it describes the reason behind. This is where Israel in the northern kingdom are led off into exile. The Assyrians come in and they are then exiled out. And it says this, all this took place because the Israelites had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of Egypt from under the power of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. They worshipped other gods and followed the practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before them, as well as the practices that the kings of Israel had introduced. The Israelites secretly did things against the Lord their God that were not right. From watchtower to fortified city, they built themselves high places in all their towns. They set up sacred stones and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every spreading tree. At every high place they burned incense, as the nations whom the Lord had driven out before them had done. They did wicked things that aroused the Lord's anger. They worshipped idols, though the Lord had said, "You shall not do this." The Lord warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets and seers. Turn from your evil ways. Observe my commands and decrees in accordance with the entire law that I commanded your ancestors to obey, and that I delivered to you through my servants, the prophets. But they would not listen and were as stiff-necked as their ancestors, who did not trust in the Lord their God. They rejected his decrees and the covenant he had made with their ancestors and the statutes he had warned them to keep. They followed worthless idols and themselves became worthless. They imitated the nations around them, although the Lord had ordered them, do not do as they do. They forsook all the commands of the Lord their God and made for themselves two idols cast in the shape of calves and an Asherah pole. They bowed down to all the starry hosts and they worshipped Baal. They sacrificed their sons and daughters in the fire. They practiced divination and saw omens and sold themselves to do evil in the eyes of the Lord, arousing his anger. So the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them from his presence. Only the tribe of Judah was left. And even Judah did not keep the commands of the Lord their God. They followed the practices Israel had introduced. Therefore, the Lord rejected all the people of Israel. He afflicted them and gave them into the hands of plunderers until he thrust them from his presence. So you can see it's kind of like God's judgment came on the people, that God allowed it for a certain length of time, but then he said, that's enough. That's time's up now. I've sent you my warning after warning after warning through the prophets, and you are just ignoring it over and over and over again. And so he said, that's it. And so, because there were no good kings in the north in 722, the Assyrians came in and they carted them all off. And they left just a few of the lower of the kind of few of the lower classes of people, if you want to put it in those terms, few of the kind of the villagers and so on, but mainly all the leadership were taken away, and then later the Babylonians did the same in Judah, and they came in, and Judah was finally exiled. So you remember, as we go back into the covenants, particularly the Mosaic covenants, it said, if you will obey me, you will be my kingdom of priests. You will be a holy nation, a nation belonging to God. The purpose for the people of Israel, kingdom of Israel, kingdom of Judah, was to be the place that everybody else looked at. And you remember the blessings and the cursings. If you obey the covenant, then you will be the most blessed nation on earth. Everything you will have rain when you have rain. You will grow, you will prosper, you will give money to and not never need money from anywhere else. I will be your protector. I will look after you. You'll have peace with all the nations around, and everything will go well with you. But they broke the covenant over and over and over again. And so there comes a point where God says, even though he's merciful and long suffering, he says, that's enough. And that's what happened. And the people were removed from the land, because instead of being the people where everybody would look at and say, this is how we follow God, this is the Yahweh that we should be following, because look how blessed they were. They were effectively such a poor advertisement, if you like, for God, that God finally said, I'm going to remove you from this land. I'm going to remove you from here so that you don't actually advertise me at all, because the advertisement, what you're showing other people about me is so poor. It doesn't even bear witness. You're actually following all the other gods instead of following me. So you're actually not showing anybody anything. And so we're left with this question at the end of 1 and 2 Kings. Well, if this is the saga over these hundreds of years, is there any hope left? And we see right at the very end of 2 Kings, in chapter 25, verse 27, it says this: in the 37th year of the exile of Jehoiachin, king of Judah, in the year our Marduk became king of Babylon, he released Joachim, king of Judah, from prison. He did this on the 27th day of the 12th month. He spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat of honor higher than those of the other kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiachin put aside his prison clothes, and for the rest of his life ate regularly at the king's table. Day by day the king gave Jehoiachin a regular allowance as long as he lived. And so you see right at the end, is there any hope? Well, the Messianic king obviously hasn't come, because they've now completely been removed from their land. But God is still active behind the scenes, that there is still maybe just a hint of a future here for the people of Israel, that his favor has not been completely removed from the people of Israel, and that out of all, of the prisoners, Jehoiachin and the king from Judah is kind of elevated even in exile. So maybe, just maybe, there is a future. But we're also left with these kind of facts in a sense that no human, no king, no prophet, no priest, or anybody else really for that matter, can ever fulfill the messianic promises of the covenant. You know, David probably became the closest. David and Solomon, in human eyes and in spiritual eyes, perhaps were the greatest human kings, at least David spiritually and Solomon physically, and yet they didn't really fulfill the messianic promises, and it went downhill after that. Elijah and Elisha are the greatest human prophets that have ever been, and yet they couldn't turn the people of Israel around, even with all the power that they would display. Do you remember on Mount Carmel where Elijah, as I said, they brought the fire down, and you think maybe here he kills off all the prophets of Baal. Maybe there will be a great kind of an outpouring of the Spirit of God, in a sense, a great revival will come across Israel after this amazing showing of the power of God. But no, and Elijah ends up having to run away into the wilderness. And so the people just refuse and refuse and refuse to turn and fulfill the promises of the covenant. And we're left with kind of saying, well, we desperately need someone to come and save us. The people of Israel are left in exile, and we have to keep on reading to into Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah to see how they start to come back and is there hope in the future. But we desperately need someone that's other than human in a sense to come and fulfill those promises. The promises are still there, the Abrahamic, the Mosaic, and the Davidic, but no human seems to be able to fulfill what's required to fulfill those covenant relationships with God. And we're left wondering, well, maybe God has to come himself to help us. And so it kind of leaves us pondering these questions about how it will be fulfilled.